Our personalities are thought to be stable over time, but when influenced by situations can cause different behaviors as well as experience gradual changes as we age. Behavior is a product of both the situation, our cultural influences, social roles, and the presence of others, and of the person, our personality characteristics. Situationism is the view that behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings. Dispositionism is the view that behavior is determined by internal factors. While social psychologists tend to take the situationist perspective, personality psychologists promote the dispositionist perspective. But modern social psychology looks at both the situation and the individual when studying human behavior. While whitewater rafting, you're more adventurous and exuberant than maybe at a wedding where you're more reverent and calm. While teaching a cooking class, you're more professional and serious than out to lunch with the girls, you're more fun loving and playful. According to some social psychologists, people tend to think of internal factors as explanations or attributions for the behavior of other people. They assume that the behavior of another person is a trait of that person and underestimate the power of the situation and fail to recognize when the behavior of another is due to situational variables and thus to the person's state. This assumption is called the fundamental attribution error. After being laid off from work, a husband comes home and is very angry when his wife asks how his day went. This is not his personality trait. This is a personality state. He's angry at the situation, not his wife.
So we're going to take a look at a branch of psychology called social psychology. So we're placed in different situations each and every day. So we can't dismiss the fact that these situations affect our behavior. This is a situational approach to behavior. And theorists place this situational approach to behavior under a branch of psychology called social psychology. So social psychology is a branch of psychology concerned with how social phenomena influences us and how people interact with others. So it focuses on the interaction between an individual and his or her environment. So this is us and our environment. And this interaction is going to shape our behavior. So in many instances, people behave very differently depending upon their situation. So behavior is seen as being influenced by external situational factors rather than internal traits or motivations. So external is a very important word, external or situational factors. So in this theory or explanation, so to say, it's hard to predict someone's behavior based off of just one situation, because that one situation isn't going to be really predictive of how they'll act or be in another situation. That's the beauty of the situational approach, is that depending on the situation, the behavior may change. So that's the assumption we need to go in with. And as social creatures, we humans base judgments and ideas about others simply off the situation in which that person behaves. But we also acknowledge, and it's important to do this, that sometimes we behave in ways that deviate from our typical character in differing situations. It's kind of like saying you can't judge a book by its cover. And attribution is the process of inferring the causes of events or behaviors. So attribution has two parts to it, but we're going to focus on one part. So attribution can either be internal or it can be external. And the external is what we're going to be focusing on today. So over the course of a day, or let me step back a bit. Attribution, I said, is the process of inferring the causes of events or behaviors. And it's something that we do every day without even really realizing that we're doing it. So, over the course of a day, we probably make tons of attributions about our own behavior as well as that of the people around us. So, the concept of attribution is actually much more complex, but since we're going to focus on the external, we'll break that part down. So the external attribution is the inference that a person is behaving a certain way because of something about the situation he or she is in. So external attribution has three main parts. And the first is consistency. So when we're looking at external or situational circumstances, we're looking at consistency. So does the person usually behave this way in the situation? And the second is distinctiveness. Now, distinctiveness in this case is, does the person behave differently in different situations? Or is this particular situation distinct? And the last is consensus. So, do others behave similarly in the situation? Now, if we can confidently answer yes to the second two questions, so the ones that regard distinctiveness and consensus. So if we can say yes to, does the person behave differently in different situations, and do others behave similarly in the situation, then we can come to the conclusion that the person is behaving in a particular way due to their situation. So here we can say the situation is having an effect on their behavior. Now, if the person usually behaves the same in each situation, then you know that their behavior is not really affected by that situation since they are consistent. So if we answer yes to this one, then we know that maybe their behavior isn't totally dependent on the situation. If it's going to be consistent from situation to the next situation to the next situation, maybe that is more of an internal attribution. So pretend you're at the zoo with your very calm and reasonable best friend, and you head over to the snakes exhibit. And although your friend doesn't like snakes, she calmly takes the time to look at them and read about all the different kinds of snakes out there. Now, one day, you have this genius idea to decide to bring a pet cobra to her house. And the second she walks in the door, she screams and freaks out and runs out, and you are totally bewildered. You have no idea what to do. Well, what can we conclude? I mean, I wouldn't say your best friend is always frantic, but clearly, based on the distinct situations she was placed in, she's going to behave differently. So, in the zoo, the snakes are all caged up. She's obviously comfortable. She knows the snake's not going to come at her. But the second you brought it in to her living room in a different situation, she felt like her safety was being endangered. So she's going to act differently in that situation. So moral of the story, situational approaches teach us more about a person the more time we spend with them and see them in different circumstances. And also, don't ever bring a snake that close and in the open to your best friend's house.
While many may suspect that people's personalities are fixed in childhood, new research suggests that most people's personalities evolve throughout their lives. Between adolescence and adulthood, you go through a host of changes: jobs, regrettable haircuts, and relationships that come and go. What about who you are at your core? As you grow older, does your personality change? Brent Roberts, a psychologist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, explains this. Personality is a developmental phenomenon. It's not just a static thing that you're stuck with and can't get over. In one study published in the journal Psychological Bulletin in 2000, researchers analyzed results of 152 longitudinal studies on personality. These studies followed participants ranging in age from childhood to early 70s. Each study measured trends in the Big Five personality traits: conscientiousness, openness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and extroversion. These researchers found that individuals' levels of each personality trait tended to stay consistent within each decade of life relative to other participants. How much do people's personalities change or remain stable from high school to retirement? To address this, a study of a U.S. sample assessed people's personality traits in adolescence and followed up with them 50 years later. This is the first study of its kind testing personality stability in which the same data source was tapped. Using 4 different methods: rank order stability, mean level change, individual level change, and profile stability, answering different developmental questions, the results turned out that the personality has a stable component across the lifespan, at trait level and profile level. But it's also malleable, and people mature with age. One major theory of personality claims that personality traits are largely set by genetics and by consequence. This would mean changes in personality traits should slow as other functions of maturation slow. In their 60s, the participants scored much higher than they had as teenagers on questions measuring calmness, self-confidence, leadership, and social sensitivity. Personality tends to get better over time. Psychologists call it the maturity principle. People become more extroverted, emotionally stable, agreeable, and conscientious as they grow older. Over the long haul, these changes are often pronounced. Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy levels tend to go down. The elderly become more altruistic and trusting individuals. Willpower increases, they develop a better sense of humor and more control over their emotions. This process of personality maturation is a gradual, imperceptible change that begins in our teenage years and continues into at least our 8th decade on the planet.
One area of your research focuses on understanding the patterns of continuity and change in personality and the mechanisms which affect them. Could you tell us a bit about your findings?
Sure. The field of personality is based on the very simple idea that there is something that is consistent in what we do, who we are. And so it's a fundamental question to the field: how consistent are people over time? And the question has been asked many, many times. And the one thing we did about 15 years ago was to compile all the evidence possible to track how consistent people were in terms of their personality across the life course. It's a question that, up until that point, had only been asked by individual researchers who had bothered to track their own cohort of individuals. And as I like to put it, it took living a life to understand how consistent personality was across the life. And I was less patient than that, so I decided to use the hard work of other people to compile all their data. And we showed quite definitively, as a 152 study meta-analysis, that personality traits are consistent, much more consistent than people had previously thought, especially at young ages, that the consistency increased with time and age, and that the peak of consistency actually occurred later in life than we expected. So the hardest possible person to change is a 50-year-old, like myself, whereas a young person is a bit more malleable, at least in terms of the personality. And then there seems to be a return to inconsistency in old age, especially. And so the study tracked and basically established the fact that personality traits were quite consistent enough to satisfy the fundamental question about whether personality existed. We then turn to a question of change, because we don't view consistency and change as the opposite ends of the same spectrum. We understand that developmentally people can be consistent but at the same time develop. For example, everybody could become more responsible with age. And so we did the same type of approach in a paper in 2006 where we compiled all the longitudinal studies we could find to track how people increase and decrease in terms of personality traits. And we found things like most people become more assertive and self-confident, especially in their 20s and 30s, which is nice. Most people become a little more agreeable or nicer as they age. It's not a very big effect. Most people become more conscientious, and they do so from starting at about age 20 and continue to change even in old age. Hopefully, most everybody becomes more emotionally stable too. That especially happens in young adults. And then finally, the last domain is what we describe as openness to experience, which carves a more unique pattern across the life course. People tend to increase when they're young and then decrease when they're old, which tracks very nicely with the political ideologies that people typically exhibit across the life course. And that trait domain is most strongly related to things like liberalism and conservatism. So those two studies serve as a foundation to, let's say, setting the table for the questions of personality development across the life course. So they show quite definitively that there is something there that people will continue to exhibit as they age, and that there are developmental trends that occur across the life course, with the most interesting thing being really that people change most and most systematically in young adulthood, not in adolescence, not in old age, though they continue to change. And that fact alone is quite interesting from a human capital or a developmental perspective, because you're seeing gains in traits that are related to a lot of very important outcomes, and the gains at a stage that most developmental psychologists hadn't considered a viable or interesting time of life to study.
So why do we change so much? Changing expectations placed on us slowly wears us in, almost like a pair of shoes. We have university life, the workforce, and starting a family. Over time, you are asked in many contexts across life to do things a bit differently, he says. There's not a user manual for how to act, but there's very clear implicit norms for how we should behave in these situations. So we adapt. While our personalities are continuously stable through age, they are also changing as we experience different day-to-day situations that may affect our personality or behavior. We are also continuously experiencing life's differing situations as we age. That also affects our personalities. We encounter each in our own way and adapt to whatever each situation represents, whether daily or over a lifetime. Do lifetime situations and daily external situations play the same role in our changing personalities and behavior?